Tell me about Bill Putnam.
Well, Bill Putnam, as I said, was the owner and chief engineer of Universal in Chicago, and we recorded that contemporary concepts album for Capitol Records, and he'd done some other Kenton things there too. And I believe it was 1957 or 58 that he moved out to Los Angeles, and he opened up United, which is on Sunset, 6,000 Sunset. And meanwhile, I had been working for Dick Bach, and I took a chance. I wrote a letter to Bill Putnam asking for work, and based on his knowing me as a saxophone player, which didn't necessarily mean anything, but I had a degree in electrical engineering, which I found out didn't have any, wasn't, well, in terminology it helps. You know what an amp is and a volt. But
Yeah.
so he took me on, and he really tried very hard to train me to be a mixer, which I would love to have done, except emotionally I was not capable of dealing with, especially very aggressive rock and roll producers, people like Phil Spector and stuff like that. I just cave in. You have to have nerves of steel to handle that. I admire mixers that can cope with that, be social creatures and still do what's right, because if you don't, you're going to get blamed for it anyway. So I was moved to mastering, in which I could do everything in a closed room, and they just slid the tapes under the door, and I came out, for air every 6 hours.
So how old was Putnam when he left Chicago? Do you know that?
Oh, 40s.
In his 40s?
Yeah.
And they opened United Western was the name of his first?
Well, it was called United First.
United First?
I mean, he didn't own Western it wasn't until the latter part of the 60s, I think, that he bought, or somewhere in the middle 60s. Because believe it or not, the school that I went to, Westlake, every week we would go down and record at Western, which was owned by a different guy, and record. We had cue music, which we wrote, cues for radio shows at that time, and big band and also studio band with flutes and stuff. So Bill bought that studio 4 or 5 years later after he opened United.
So United was one place and Western was yet another. Was it in a different location, Western?
No, it's a block away
Still
from United,
Up the street?
Yeah.
Right. And then they had that famous arrangement where they had the echo chambers in one building and lines running up the street to the other building, and they would patch it in.
Yeah, but the thing is, they had an echo chamber. Bill had opened Bill's partner was a guy named Bunny Robine, who was legendary, an engineer. He's the man that actually liberated the first Ampex. He was in the Signal Corps in the Army in World War II. And he liberated the Ampex, the one that Eisenhower was supposed to use, and then they hadn't erased part of it. Did you hear that? And Hitler was making a speech on it.
No.
And he heard that, and General Eisenhower, he would never use it. But Bunny put it in his locker, and when he came back to the United States, the first thing that we got off the boat, like a colonel or something, came up to him and said, "We'll take that." So,
when you say you liberated, you mean the Ampex machine was in Germany and
he
brought it back?
Yeah, because he went through the war there. And,
we didn't have tape recorders here in the U.S. at that time.
I don't think so.
And so he brought this Ampex tape machine from Germany.
Yeah.
And that was one of the very first.
Because
magnetic tape machines being used here in town.
It used a metal tape. I mean, actual metal, not plastic. So he was a great engineer, and he had a great studio in Fairfax where all kinds of hits were made, like Fats Domino and people like that. And he had
do you remember the cross street? Do you remember exactly where it was?
Well, it's approximately across the street west of where CBS is now, that area. It's right in the middle of the Fairfax district, and it was a small studio, and some of the greatest hits were made there. And they had an echo chamber he had 11 engineers at United, by the way, when going at its peak, and everybody wanted that chamber, So they used phone lines, I guess, Class A phone lines to patch down there from United. And I've never heard, so far I haven't heard any digital machines that can equal that, because it had the
old-
first echo came right up behind the sound, so it was almost like an equalizer. It fattened the sound. We've talked
Right,
about that.
and it was a room with tiled walls, was it, or just a cement room? Do you remember what it looked like? Did you ever go in there?
I don't know, but I assumed that it was a very special plaster that United used,
Mm-hmm.
a plaster that took 3 months to dry, by the way.
Oh, must have been dense.
Yes, and it could have been. It was definitely an echo chamber that didn't exist before, if that's what you mean. Like Capitol used to use the stairwell as an echo chamber way back at the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
because it just happened to have a pretty good decay period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe Capitol still has their old echo chambers, which are now located underneath the parking lot, so they
Yeah.
didn't need the room for anything, and they didn't have to get rid of them for anything.
No,
And I think they're still there and still can be used now if
Yeah.
anybody cares to.
Yeah,
Which was just a hard-walled room with a speaker of some kind in there, and you would send in sound to the speaker, and it would play, and then you'd have microphones in there that would pick it up and send it back, and you'd mix that in. And
that's right.
That's how those things
And they
work.
did it in stereo too.
Mm-hmm. 2 microphones.
2 speakers. Yeah.
2 speakers too, huh? Well, that's extremely interesting. Was Bill Putnam an innovator,
Absolutely.
and what were some of his main contributions?
Well, I'll speak in general terms, because it's only in later years I realize how much he's done. I've read things in the AES and so forth, journal. But among other things, the limiter, the United limiter, was one of the things that he developed right there in our studio, and it was all tube at that time, obviously, and he had a couple of ladies that just looked like, like housewives, like kind of plump ladies, and they were hand wiring up there. And
Soldering things and wiring them all up.
yeah, and I'll never forget 2 things. I was cutting. Sometimes people would ask me to cut rather strange discs. There's a rather famous record from this period of people farting. Oh, shouldn't say that word. Passing wind, and long, quite kind of funny. This kind of thing men like, but women don't like usually. And I looked out the door of Studio F and mastering, and it was one of the ladies was peeking around the corner, and she said, "Could you make me a copy of that? I'll never forget it."
So,
Just in regard to that, his limiter, one day said, "Bill," he said, "look at this limiter," and it looked like it was just chassis on it with a panel. And I said, and it was closed up, and he said, "Lift this up," and it was pretty heavy because the transformers, were, and it went like this. Well, it was the first solid state, no transformer.
did that become the Teletronics tube type limiter ultimately?
Doesn't the
That
Universal still exist? Doesn't it have the name Universal?
Yeah, Universal Audio.
Yeah.
Universal, UREI.
Yeah.
Universal Recording Engineering
And
Industries.
he developed the time-aligned loudspeaker, among other things. There were a lot of things. One thing that failed was an early analog attempt at making an echo chamber, and he used it using the principle of the discharge of a condenser, which has a curve like that. And it almost killed him. He spent so much time and heart into developing that, and it worked, but it was too prone to problems. It was like a whole chain and a drum of condensers that supposedly would decay, whatever, exponentially. But that one didn't make it. He also developed the first of the real toxic gas sniffers there that can sniff out carbon monoxide and stuff like that. I remember seeing that.
Was that just sort of a side thing? Was
Well-
he trying to develop audio products, or?
Yeah, well, he was an amazingly brilliant guy, because nothing was impossible to him. He built the first consoles himself. Later on, he got an old German guy to build them, But he built the 12-channel console in Studio A. It was all hand-wired, and